So you know what? I'm going to take a few questions. Does anyone have a question? Go ahead.
One question in 42 parts. This is money for Kevin. Kevin, I'm Ben. My son Nate. We're huge fans.
I remember you're from the Facebook.
Yeah, exactly.
Glad you can come out.
Absolutely. The whole reason was because of the media, and you're reaching out. In fact, I think I suggested, hey, you should do an online. You said, how about if I showed up in person?
Right.
So awesome that you're here. What kind of gear are you guys using? You know, what are you writing with? When it comes down to it, is it just nothing more than a laptop and a controller, and you guys are just going at it? I mean, to what extent do you guys write the music and compose it and actually create?
Well, I'll start this one off, but these guys have much more experience in that than I do. But I use Logic for anything I'm doing, like with synth orchestral stuff. But as far as the rock tunes go, I try to cost Activision nothing when I make it. So I use drum samples and triggers so I can kind of play them in, and I have a bass and DI that I use, and then a guitar amp emulator. And then we do all the vocal recording in the audio studio at Traer with the guys in the audio department. So we take zero budget doing it, and we try to match it up with recordings that we hear. So
that becomes a bonus.
Legitimate, yeah. They like the fact that it doesn't cost anything to begin with.
That's fantastic.
Or cost very little.
Hey, how about the rest of you guys? What does it take to write? I mean, obviously it takes quite a bit.
I mean, 20 years ago, you had to have a studio and musicians. Nowadays, because of the technology and because of software, you can sort of recreate an orchestra in software. Generally, I mean, I always have felt, and I still do, that real players make a huge difference. But you can certainly mock it up, and you're working with someone. You have to get their approval. If they don't like something, they let you know, and you fix it, change it, whatever, modify it. But then in the end of that process, generally, I get an orchestra and report that and then mix that in with my samples. But obviously, there's all this great technology out there. I use an application called Digital Performer. It uses Logic. These are common applications, and then tons and tons of samples and sounds that I have and buy constantly that add to my palette of sounds, from orchestral to all kinds of effects and you name it. So it's really like everything these days. Software and computers have made really enormous strides in what we're capable of technologically. It used to be for film composers had a piano and paper and pencil, and that was the extent. But nowadays it's a whole new world.
So you know what? I actually have one more. I have a question. When it comes to composing for a video game, obviously this is something that has to start early on because they need an idea. You guys get the idea of what the sound they're looking for, what the game's going to be about. Do you actually get like kind of similar to how they did it? I don't know how they do it in movies now, but back in the day in the movies, you'd have the movie playing and be able to see and feel what that's going to look like. So do you get a preview of what the game looks like prior to writing the song, so you kind of get the feeling for each part of that, where that's going to go? Or does the company get that, you pretty much bring them the music and they say, well, this is going to sound good in this part of our game?
No, usually, the company usually being brought out to the process very early, so there's almost nothing. So we get some concept art, which is really cool. We get some, very, very basic definition, but, big part of writing for a computer game is just using your imagination, because there's not a lot to work with. There's no pictures, there's no movies, there's nothing basically. Vague descriptions.
Sometimes I do the game is sufficiently advanced that I get they'll play the game in the section that they want me to compose for. They'll tell me, I will get an in-depth description of what they want the music to do. But then I'll understand the game. But they'll actually do a video capture of gameplay. And though the player experience will not be locked to that, because everyone plays the game differently and different things trigger music, there's interactivity, but it'll just give me a feel and a vibe for that, what's going on visually and what you're doing at that time, which is I find very helpful. But as Inon says, you don't always get that. Sometimes you're involved and you need to write music based upon very basic art concept or just descriptions by the audio director.
I've started all of my game projects with cutscenes that were static scenes with some dialogue, and that helps me establish a tone for the game. And then I'll get gameplay playthroughs of levels that I'll score just like I would score a motion picture.
I have a question for you, actually, Sean. When you were writing the score for Black Ops for single player, obviously the single player is Vietnam-based. Did the music of that time have any influence on your writing?
Originally, we discussed a lot about bringing in elements from the 60s.
Okay.
And as the game moved away from being about Vietnam and more about covert operations all around the world, the game really developed. I worked on it for a year, so I was there very early on. And it changed quite a bit from the beginning to the end. So as it became less about the Cold War in Vietnam and more about Black Ops and a time period of about 8 or 9 years, then I saw that the world opened up musically. And we were in Southeast Asia, so I could combine some of the elements of the locales there. We were in Kazakhstan, so I was able to use more Russian-influenced themes. So we really globe-trotted, and I would, try and use attributes and ethnicities from those areas. But I was more interested in getting a psychological focus with the music more than anything, and it was all about the paranoia of the Cold War, and all about, just being covert and being a badass.
So getting that feeling, yeah. Well, again, with all the music and all these games, again, without that music, I think the games would just kind of be an empty slate. It'd be like okay, well, I get to shoot this guy. Okay. We don't get that, we get that sense of feeling, we get that heart pounding, the music's building up, we know something's going to happen, but we don't know what, and I think that's the feeling with all the gamers is, without this music, we wouldn't have that feeling in our games. It wouldn't be like us actually being in a movie and playing that movie and being a part of this. So I think the music helps with bringing us back to that. So thank you. Do I have any more questions? You got first.
Yeah, I had read some articles before about how music is being more of a dynamic force in games. And sometimes, like if you're in a fight scene or something, the music will pick up, and if you're in a slow-paced section, the music will kind of be really low key. How much does that come into when you guys compose music?
Right, interactivity is getting more and more sophisticated as the technology permits, which means at times we're writing our music and essentially writing it. Well, there's a lot of different techniques that are evolving, and it really depends on the game and the audio director you're working with. But very often you'll write music in layers, meaning that all the music can work together at once. Maybe there's 3 layers. But if you mute one of the layers and then bring it in, that adds intensity so that if the player's experiences in combat and all of a sudden you're off and you're in a firefight, that top layer will quickly fade in and generating more intensity. And then if you escape from that or hide away or something like that, then that layer can also be faded out. So yeah, that's interactive aspects of the music, which is one of the main ways that it is different from film and TV, because that obviously doesn't operate in that fashion.
Kind of along with like the interactive music part, like do you structure your music a little differently for video games than for like TV shows and stuff like that? And like how much of a role do you play in like controlling the interactive, or how it plays into the interactive parts?
Every studio is different. I mean, every different developer has a different way of implementing the music, different sound engines. With Black Ops, Kevin knows the sound engine intimately, but my approach is much more cinematic. It's more like writing for a motion picture. Even when you're working on a long section of gameplay, you're not going to hit as many points throughout the gameplay because you know that it's going to change randomly. But if you score it like a film, it's going to be dynamic and exciting anyway. But there's limitations with some engines, and it depends on how much audio you have going. Black Ops and the Call of Duty material has a lot of ambient sound effects, many layers of audio. So you're limited what you can do with the audio engine for music.
Along the lines of all this layering, how much do you guys have to stay thinking about key signature and time? Because
Well,
as things change quickly, I notice on some games that, you're going things where there's like no relativity between keys whatsoever. And on other things where it's just seamless and you're like, oh wow, you just switched minor and didn't even feel it.
well, you have a technique that I'm using a lot in RPGs that actually variations. So basically, you take 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes cue, and you write it, and then you write 2 more versions of this cue, but in different intensity. Now, the audio engine has this ability to follow, the cue and know, and when, like, you have, for example, more enemies coming towards you, then it'll pick up exactly where it left off, but in the higher intensity. So the transition is going to be totally seamless because it's essentially the same. It's the same cue. This is just one of the techniques. You try to write music. You don't try to limit yourself to something that will have a better transition. You just try to force the tools to your music rather than to force your music into the tools.
I do it a little bit differently. And it seemed to work, at least on the Uncharted series, which is instead of writing a 2-minute piece of music that is 2 minutes of nonstop music, I tend to write 30 or 45-second increments that build to some sort of musical crescendo, leave a little bitty break, which you can fill with an ethnic instrument, and then start up again. If you do that, you can almost shift any key, and it's going to sound okay because the break makes it not sound like F minor to E minor or something like that. So in leaving a little break, not only can they shift to a different piece, they can shift to any piece of music if they wanted a faster piece of music. And you don't have to always go exactly with the picture. The fact that you're fighting on screen doesn't mean music has to be big all the time. You have sound effects, you have sound design, you have all the things that fill it up. So whenever you break things apart like that, you serendipitously catch events that you never really caught. And Sony, who does the game implementation, I have nothing to do with it, always gets questions about how in the world did you script it? And they didn't script it. It just happened by virtue of the design of doing things that way.
And if there are jarring key changes or whatever, that's probably a mistake of implementation. I don't think they did a particularly good job in probably doing some of the things that perhaps you're talking about. I think that sounds like sloppy implementation. Right?
That would be the sound designer's fault.
We're gonna blame Kevin.
But as the game engines are becoming more sophisticated, the choices that they have are much greater than they used to be, so they can do a better job with the music because the engine is more powerful, and then it depends on the musicality of whoever is doing the implementation and how they script the engine. So games are only going to get better.
Cool, thanks.
Go ahead.
The music that we heard at the top of this presentation sort of highlighted a theme that I've seen with a lot of A-list titles over the last few years, which is moving to music that is more epic in scope and more orchestral in design. Is this a conscious decision to move away from sort of the chiptune sounds of the 80s and the 90s, or is this just the way everything has evolved?
Well, obviously, quality, when we say quality, then we look at big budget, and many producers want their project to sound expensive. And so sounding expensive is sort of following what's going on in the motion picture world. And we do it, but in many cases, like for me with Fallout games, the game did not call for this kind of expensive sound. It's more of an ambient sound and more of a unique, weird score, so we're going for that. The budgets are way bigger, so we can allow ourselves to indulge in big orchestras, and that's the result.
Anyone else?
By the way, there's one addendum to that, and I don't know that this is necessarily consciously what games are thinking. I worked on a TV show called King of the Hill for years, which was an animated show.